Velina, welcome everyone. My name is Noel Kahanu. I'm channeling my inner Gina. um, all right, so I'm officially opening with Oli Velina Manoa. Velina Manoa ikale hua aloha, aloha ua tuahine. Mai lua hinea I Waikiki, kia I ke kahau kani, kani no na leo, eo kama aina aloha manoa Belina.
Aloha mai kako. Magadang gavi. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you to Noel Kahanu of American Studies for that beautiful Oli. Thank you to Tyler Ramos, our talented musician from our Department of Music, for his beautiful piece just now. Thank you all for joining us tonight on this important address on nation, democracy, and resistance. Our speaker this evening is a champion of literature and the political novel. I'm really eager, as you are, to hear what she has to say. A great many people made this evening possible. Let me just thank a few of them. Let me thank the donors to the Inouye Endowment. Thank you all for your generosity for supporting this important source of for the chair. Members of the Inouye Committee, including members of the Department of American Studies and the law school, thank you for your support and your work. The staff at UH Foundation and the talented students with the Better Tomorrow Speakers Series, mahalo for your work in making this possible. The Inouye Chair is a real gem for us here at the University of Hawaii. It was established almost 20 years ago in 2005 by the senator himself and his wife, Maggie, with the purpose of recognizing renowned leaders across fields that include genres that include artists, filmmakers, elected political officials, historians, social scientists, musicians, lawyers, you name it. The only requirement was that we select individuals who make a substantial contribution to democratic ideals. Now, for the senator himself, this was no small matter. Having fought against fascism in Europe in the Second World War and against anti-Japanese bigotry, among his other political commitments in the US, Dan Inouye never took democracy for granted. I think we've all learned, especially in recent years, how right he was and how much we can appreciate that commitment. The Inouye Chair is jointly held by the Department of American Studies and the College of Arts, Languages, and Letters and the William S. Richardson School of Law. And we've had, in our time that we've held the Inouye Chair, an enormous number of speakers. Let me just name a few of them. The iconic author and activist, Angela Davis, the legendary filmmaker, John Sayles, the award-winning Native poet, Allison Hedge Koch, the Harvard psychologist, Robert Waldinger, and many, many more. In fact, the very first chair Inouye Chair in 2005 was the very dean of modern Black American history, John Hope Franklin. We've learned tremendously from them, especially when they stay for an entire semester, as our chair is doing this semester. To introduce our speaker, I'd like to introduce in turn Patricia Halagao, who's one of our own faculty members, herself an active scholar, teacher, and community leader of consequence. Patricia is a co-director of UH's Center for Philippine Studies, which is located in the School of Pacific and Asian Studies, and the chair of curriculum studies in the College of Education. She is an expert in multicultural education. That's another program we've learned not to take for granted right now in the US. And she's played a key role in shaping instruction in Hawaii as a researcher, teacher, trainer, and member of the State's Board of Education. Now, most recently, this is really cool, especially to me as a historian, Patricia worked with the Filipino Curriculum Project, a team of high school students and educators, to develop a social studies course on Filipino history and culture that is the first in the nation to be adopted by a statewide school district. Mahalo for that. And mahalo to the students who work with you, Patricia. Please give a warm welcome to Patricia, who will introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Dean Arnade. And mahalo to the Dan and Maggie Inouye Distinguished Chair in Democratic Ideals, and the many departments and people who made tonight's evening possible. Aloha, my name is Patricia Halagao, and I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker tonight. When I was first asked to introduce Gina Apostol, I have to admit I was very honored and intimidated. Who was I to introduce one of our literary giants in the Filipino community, let alone in the world? Gina Apostol's literary accomplishments are incredibly impressive. She has written 5 novels, each with their own accolades, beginning with her latest book, La Tercera, a family saga set in her home province, Leyte, examining the effects of American occupation in the Philippines. In 2022, she won the Rome Prize in Literature to work on her next book, The Treatment of Pause, on Filipino radicalism in Europe at the end of the century. Her body of work was shortlisted for the John Dos Passos Prize, and her 4th book, Insurrecto, rooted in her research on the Philippine-American War, was named by the Publishers Weekly one of the 10 best books of 2018 and shortlisted for the Dayton Peace Prize. Gun Dealer's Daughter, set during the waning years of the Marcos dictatorship, won the 2013 PEN Open Book Award. And her first 2 novels, Bibliolepsy and The Revolution According to Raimundo Mata, won the prestigious Philippine National Book Award. So as you can tell from her political topics, Gina is a brave writer. She's not afraid to tackle the often untold and complicated intertwined histories of the Philippines and America. US imperialism, the Philippine-American War, which resulted in the deaths of anywhere from 200,000 to 1 million Filipino civilians, martial law, the Marcos era, the Duterte regime, all with themes of subjugation, war, and revolution. A review of her reviews describes her writings as with overlapping voices, simultaneously contradictions, stories within stories, multitudinous visions. And if any of you have read Gina's work, I think you all agree her work is both heavy and light, serious and comical at times, and not an easy read. I know, I have most of her books. She forces you to learn about the context and research it. Nothing is handed to you when you read her stories. It's multilingual, makes you think, make connections, and connect the dots. As reviewers describe, it is dense, but to be savored a little bit at a time. Layered and fully realized, it is deserving of several readings. Though set in the past in the Philippines, specific, her books, though, are very timeless and universal. Her themes teach us lessons to be learned from the Philippines historically, especially in our current moment. Many contend, and I contend as well, that her work is even more important today as we struggle to keep up the democratic principles of today. which is the theme of tonight, to see the connection between literature and life. And Gina asked, what is to be done? If this is our situation, if we're in a crisis, if this is our government, what is to be done? So today's event date is not lost on me. Gina chose February 22, the first day of the EDSA, the People Power Revolution, against Marcos's dictatorship, which resulted in the restoration of democracy. So we remember today and ask, what is to be done? On a personal note, I had the opportunity to get to know Gina a little bit more. And I was surprised to discover that she is a high school teacher at the Ethical Cultural Fieldston School in New York. As a teacher myself, I actually had assumed she was a professor in higher education. She said it was actually common for people to assume that she was in higher ed, given the topics and the complex topics that she writes about. We talked about a range of topics, bonded over curriculum and pedagogy, talked about our daughters, but I was struck by the commonality that the work of a novelist synthesizes and translates reality, much like educators do with our own students. At the end of our conversation, I asked her what she wanted people to know about her that people might not know about her. And she said, she writes mainly for fun. It's a matter of pleasure, she said. So even though her books are deep and dark and complex, know that she's enjoying every bit of educating us, opening up our world and perspectives. And with that, it is my great honor to introduce Gina Apostol.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Patricia. And that thing about teaching high school, I believe in children. It is my honor to be here. Thank you to the University of Hawaii for this huge honor. When I was invited to come to Manoa, above all, I accepted this honor as a matter of recognition for Filipinos. Whose part in America is essential to its democratic ideals. When the Filipino is not seen in America's story, America fails to see itself fully. I would like to, this is off the cuff, I would like to thank Tyler Ramos for the song, Ang Bayan Ko, Ang Bayan Kong Pilipinas, Lupain ng Ginto't Bulaklak. And that refrain, Ibon mang may layang lumipad, kulungin mo at umiiyak, bayan pa kayang bayan pa kayang ang di magnasang makaalpas. So that song was a song constantly sung when I was a very young, I just kept going to marches under martial law at the University of the Philippines. Ang bayan ko means my country. Ang bayan kong Pilipinas, lupain ng ginto't bulaklak, land of gold and flowers. And that refrain, ibon mang may layang lumipad, the bird who might be free to fly, kulungin mo at umiiyak. When you cage it, it cries. And it is a cry for freedom, which is really central, I think, to what I'm trying to do with my work and also with my sense of why the Philippines is central to world historical democratic traditions. It is a country whose wars and whose beginnings are so much part of this question of democracy. I accepted this honor because my own work as a writer comes from my absolute belief that the story, history, and culture of Filipinos are crucial to this nation's making, an instructive and imperative part of it. We need to know it. Philippine history is part of American history, and American history is part of Philippine history, each encased in each. So thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. Speech making, in my experience, is a wayward act. And so right off the bat, I'll summarize here what I think my speech today might contain, given that the title I have given the committee, No Democracy Left Behind, Nation, Narration, and Resistance. One, I'll talk about the act of reading novels as analogy for enacting democracy. And two, about novels themselves as a form of resistance. And in that case, I'll be talking about Jose Rizal, my personal favorite. I've been thinking about this speech ever since I arrived in Hawaii last January 6th, an auspicious date to be thinking about democracy, fiction, imagination, and nations. I understand some in the country celebrated that day, honoring an insurrection against one's own government, inspired by one's own sitting president who had won his fictional election in his own mind. Such a situation indicates that somewhere, somehow, a concept of democracy has certainly been left behind. Misplaced, misconstrued, misidentified, abused. For most Americans, but I guess not for enough of us, the incidents of January 6th seemed a horror show of the imagination, when a matter of fiction, fake news, took on such urgent reality to some that their enthralled hallucination became an emergency for the nation. It's instructive for us to reflect, in that case, on the power of the imagined, the constructed, alternate story of the stolen election, sustained by too many undemocratic storytellers who were in power, produced from a bubble of daily, sustained, calendrical, nonsensical, surreal narrations in what I call algorithm capitalism. This entrepreneurial 21st century mode of creating ideological communities for profit. I almost said imagined communities, but I did not, because that would be a cynical misuse of Benedict Anderson's beautifully dynamic term for the making of nations. Someone once asked me about the difference between insurrection and revolution when one of my novels, The Revolution According to Raimundo Mata, came out in the United States at the time. Actually, it came out during the month of the insurrection. In that case, I answered in terms of the history several of my novels deal with, the Philippine Revolution against Spain and America. Those revolutions were a movement of Filipinos to free themselves from colonizers and invaders. It was about freedom, sovereignty, ang mga karapatan ng tao. So the national hero, the novelist Jose Rizal, translated the French Revolution's 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man, word for word, in a document found among his effects after the Spaniards killed him for his novels in 1896. The revolution was grounded on the moral weight of natural rights. I said to the interviewer, I think Black Lives Matter, for instance, has a similar weight. One cannot argue Breonna Taylor's right to sleep in her home without invasion and murder by police. One cannot argue George Floyd's right not to be murdered because of a grocery transaction. And today, in a different moment from the Black Lives activism of that time, one cannot argue Palestinians' right to live, though many try. In 1896, Filipinos were revolutionaries, trying to change society that did not see them as fully human. Their anti-colonial war asserted that primal sense of right and thus an overturning of an unjust order. But when in 1899, the Philippine-American War broke out, Filipinos were called insurrectos by Americans. The Americans actually used the language of its former enemy, Spain, this misnomer, this mislabeling of Filipino desire. To the American colonizer, Filipino revolutionaries had no right. They were going against an established order to which Filipinos had not consented. And in the wake of such terminology, the US committed genocide on a people. They torched villages as they wished. They created concentration camps, or reconcentrados as they were called. They policed and surveilled and treated the country as an enemy military camp. In one notorious moment, a US general called on his soldiers to kill all men in the province of Samar above 10 years of age, Samar being part of the Waray group of islands I come from. They called their rule benevolent assimilation. The US colonized the Philippines via that fiction, the illusion of that shining city on a hill, but it was in fact savage thuggery that girded the US imperial project in the Philippines. And that's how Filipinos came to America. We are here because American guns were there. Speaking of savage thuggery, those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were in fact insurrectionists, certainly no revolutionaries. They were going against an established order, but not out of natural rights. To be honest, in my view, they were against other people's natural rights, Blacks, Mexican Americans, Muslims, Jews, and so on. No one has a natural right to have the president or dumb red hat that they desired just because. What's interesting is that those writers claimed they were an echo of 1776. Once again, a throwback to the illusion of that shining city, which actually comes from a speech from 1630, to be clear, right at the doorstep of US's history of genocide. In my view, I said those writers were in fact echoes of old thuggery that has accompanied American illusion. It's that thuggish illusion imposed on Native Hawaiians in 1898, on Native Americans at the nation's founding, on Blacks throughout US history, on the people America has colonized and occupied domestically and around the world. My point here is that for me, what people tend to see as nation, the shining city, or in the case of the Philippines, the nation of Rizal, can also be seen as illusions that have constructed us, fatally or not. Nations in that sense are like novels, constructed for particular, and may I say also, productive reasons. Nations are productive, but elusive, or in Anderson's adjective, imagined. And I do think it's healthy for us to recognize them as so, because we are usually blind to our nation's contingency and textuality and historicity, its fictiveness. For instance, it's too bad the story of a fake election in 2020 was not read by those readers as a novel, because two aspects of a novel's productive transactions were missing. One, the interrogation of authorship, examining the author's goals, craft, and manipulation. And two, a probing sense of readership, a reflexivity by which we examine our own desires in relation to that other, that text. It seems to me that undemocratic forces, those that construct stories in order to keep their power, privilege, or profit, prefer to hide their fiction as fiction. Novels cannot, not even the realist novel. That transparent aspect of novel making in which the text, even as it functions as mirror to reality, is also only an interpretive transaction. That aspect of the art of fiction seems sadly absent among fascists. Which brings me to another date, another fascist, another presidential election. Relevant on this day, as mentioned by Patricia, February 22, 2024, almost 40 years ago today, to be exact, 38 years ago, on February 22, 1986, Filipinos rose up against a ruthless, lying, and murderous dictatorship. It is true that the dictator family did end up here in Hawaii, but when Professor Caldwell offered me this date for the speech, I said that is a perfect date to talk about nation, imagination, and resistance. Filipinos rose up on this day against the 20-year iron fist rule of Ferdinand Marcos and his wife Imelda. I grew up in Imelda's hometown, so that's why I'm completely bullshit. Okay, after 4 days of occupying peacefully in protest the central artery of Manila, what's called EDSA, Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, the Filipino people toppled the dictator in what at this time seemed to me this amazing novelistic act with its own chapter title, People, Power, Rebellion. A chapter not just in the cuento, or in my language, what I historia, of the Philippines, but in world historical timelines. The 1986 People Power Revolt has its own place in the world story chapters of democracy. I call it a rebellion, not a revolution, because after all, the Philippines has not structurally changed. Oligarchs remain. Dictators have newly emerged. Another Marcos is in power. But again, that's a topic for another speech. What I'd like to note here for a moment, what I felt as a kid in those times. I grew up in the Philippines, and I was on those streets. I was not yet 20 when the protests erupted. The 1986 revolt was a culmination that had begun, on one hand, 3 years earlier, when a senator, Marcos's political enemy, was assassinated in broad daylight on an airport tarmac in his attempt to return to the Philippines from exile on August 21, 1983. And suddenly everyone, it seemed to me, was on Manila streets. But we students had already been on the streets years before, trying to get others to get involved. When I arrived at the University of the Philippines in Diliman as a freshman, one of the first things I did was join a street march organized by my schoolmates, protesting what was then, it was called the Education Act, protesting martial law. The events of 1986 were not a spontaneous combustion. Many had already protested and organized and died years before. No successful rebellion arises in the blink of an eye. Protest is an arc, not a spark. Many had been organizing and mobilizing decades before our time, most memorably in what people now sometimes call, it's the title of a novel, by the way, by the great Tagalog novelist Lualhati Bautista, Dekada 70. The 70s decade of the first quarter storm, and those powerful months when students, farmers, workers, politicians, teachers, and so on joined the barricades before and after martial law descended on September 21, 1972. For Filipinos, by the way, these dates are engraved in memory. After which too many activists were jailed or killed, the Philippine Constitution was suspended, a new dictator-approved parliamentary system was ratified, and Ferdinand Marcos became, as long as he could help it, president for life, free to pillage the country's coffers and run roughshod over democracy. Marcos wrote a book, ghostwritten, of course, by his very able Filipino technocrats, titled Our Revolution, Democracy. Smells like benevolent assimilation, fascist fiction. But on this other plane of imagination, that bodily experience of democracy, when the fruit of decades of organizing came to this historical conjuncture, and now so many were moved by what we had long been marching for, that the state was corrupt and needed change. Makibaka, huwag matakot, Marcos, Hitler, diktador, tuta, imperialismo, ibagsak. We called it the U.S. Marcos dictatorship because Marcos was supported by U.S. money and guns. The Philippines was site of Cold War geopolitics. Marcos kept power by invoking the terrors of communist insurgency, thus killing farmers, workers, students, labor leaders, and of course his political enemies with U.S. Cold War money that bolstered his police and army. But those days in February, the whole of Metro Manila, it seemed to me, was in the state of animated suspension, as of readers in medias res, sharing this not metaphorical but actual sense of a novel's contingency, which otherwise I had found most powerfully only in reading. It's true that at the time I was actually writing a novel. My first novel, Bibliolepsy, begun when I was 19, which had first been about books and fucking, and ended up being about street revolt. Right, but you know. My life as a writer, not so strangely, enough for a person who grew up under martial law, began with the rebellion. I describe the day of protest this way in that first novel, Bibliolepsy. I'm gonna read from the boring part, not the fucking part. Up and down, up and down Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, the Epiphany on EDSA. Crowds were swelling, strolling, ogling. Office workers in straw hats, layabouts in slippers, nuns, nurses, lawyers carrying backpacks and lovers holding hands. A seminarian held aloft a gigantic white cross, flocks of women in the blue sash and white shifts of Our Lady of Lourdes followed, a passing drone of prayer. Ladies held paper bags along with their rosaries. Everyone was prepared for both miracles and lunch. When I emerged from a crowd of socialites in high-teased hairdos and lowly yellow shirts, I found I'd lost my friend Fernando. I saw among a crowd sitting before the secured gates of Camp Aguinaldo, a beggar with his begging can full of leaflets, a score of what seemed to be school children unpacking their snacks, and a plastic tent with a red cross on it. By a table outside the tent, a white-clothed intern was listening to the radio, fanning herself, where once traffic had clogged this street, the longest thoroughfare in Metro Manila. People now held power. A 5-mile traffic of residents going about their daily business, making change and eating peanuts. This was the city's revolution. To change the fate of the country, all they needed was to arrive. So under fascist rule, Filipinos had been given a text to read. The lies of the Marcos government about the assassination of the senator, the fake reprieve of the snap presidential elections held on February 7, 1986, to signify the illusion of democracy under Marcos, the suspenseful counting of the ballots reported in the news, the declaration of Marcos as winner. I remember as a voter at my university, following my precinct's ballot box to its repository at Quezon City Hall. A whole crowd of us readers, I mean citizens, acting upon our own interpretation of the dictator's text and unwilling to follow his scoundrel script and deviate from our insistence on our plot of democracy. Throughout the country, people held vigils in front of those ballot boxes. I was only one of hundreds of thousands. And I remember 2 days after the national counting of the ballots, how a group of people walked out of the counting place. 35 ordinary employees contracted under the Commission on Elections. Some in their 20s, my age, emerged from the plenary hall of the PICC, the Philippine International Convention Center, where the computerized quick counting of all the nation's ballots were being held. And I remember this stunning scene of these 30 men and 5 women. The women were, of course, the spokespeople, walking out of the tabulation center and into history. They were computer technicians. And in the aftermath, the story was they saw discrepancies in the tabulations. They were so dismayed, and they needed to get a drink. They needed to figure out what to do, but they took evidence of their tabulations with them. But they ran into this group of people, activists, election observers. Some of the Americans in the crowd included then Senator John Kerry, a Democrat, and Senator Richard Lugar, a Republican, sent by Marcos's friend, Ronald Reagan, to monitor the elections. The group of 35 ran into these observers, staggering and shaking into the spotlight, and they ended up giving a press conference that transfixed us, the readers of the nation. I am going to read here exactly what they said. The rebuke to power that is thrilling to me because it's also prosaic in the way that reality has the tendency to be both astonishing and mundane. We are computer technicians who were hired for the 1986 Comelec National Tabulation Project. We walked out of the project on February 9, 1986 for a basic professional reason. We did not want ourselves to be used in any way that violates fundamental professional ethics. We were made to believe from the start that the job was going to be a professional one. The honor, responsibility, and challenge that we saw in the project were enough to vindicate the hard work and long nights spent developing the computerized system before it was to start operating on February 7. We emphasize it was a spontaneous act of protest. We have no leader, we are not syndicated, nor do we wish to be linked to any partisan motives. None of us has any political affiliation. We are just independent-minded persons whose only desire is to preserve the purity of our profession. To be honest, they were accused of being part of the opposition and so on, but they kept saying, no, we're just tabulators. This marvelous group continued. When the discrepancy between the computer tabulation reports and the figures on the tally board was detected, the immediate reaction from us was one of indignation and utter frustration. It hurt us to see a deliberate betrayal of trust. It did not matter who was winning or losing. Cheating, whether by 1 or 100,000, is still cheating. It was an insult to our most basic sensibilities, both moral and professional, and we did not want to have anything to do with it. The walkout was an escape from our intolerable situation. We just wanted to leave and go to some place where we could drink our blues away. It's so beautiful. All they needed was San Miguel beer. They continued to think that all we wanted was to be true to ourselves and to the job that we do best, under threat of losing what was otherwise a respectable job at the National Computer Center. I just love this elevation of the IT department to national hero. That's what democracy looks like. It's a beautiful moment, a beautiful declaration in which all they wanted was to be good computer technicians. As mundane as Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, except Bartleby preferred not to work, whereas they were protesting the results of an election to be true to themselves, to their jobs. The LA Times on February 10, 1986, reported what Marcos said. Asked about the operator's charges on NBC TV's Meet the Press, Marcos said, "We would like to see what kind of evidence they got. All they do is scream and shout." The LA Times continued, the operators said they took copies of the tampered data when they fled. Colonel Pedro Barawidan, chief of the military-run National Computer Center, warned that criminal charges will be brought against the technicians if they took data outside the tabulation center. I'm going to be honest. I had no idea the National Computer Center was run by the military, but I don't know why I was surprised. So here we have these readers, government employees, these ordinary, though I do think they were extraordinary citizens, reading the contingent text that is democracy. The unfolding of events without knowing their ending and yet sustaining a faith. They had no idea what was going to happen, what their walkout would mean in terms of their future. They were in a novel whose denouement was not in sight, and they staked their lives. And I remember thinking then about their danger, and I know now that they had to go underground into safe houses. From the convention center, they walked straight into refuge in Baclaran Church and went from one underground haven to another, escaping the police. They managed to get back home only when street demonstrations exploded, eventually into the massive rebellion of February 22 to 25, precipitated in many ways by them, much to their surprise, I think, these unnamed workers who mainly needed to get a drink. These readers of fascist fiction who said, "No, we see the author's construction. No, we reject that plot." They understood as readers that they too were part of the nation's story. They recognized democracy as contingent, a text in flux, the outcome hanging. They had a stake in truth and determined to get the plot right, and so walked out into history. I remember those moments distinctly because everything was so much in the air. What would happen to the workers? What would happen next? The nation went onto the streets. I remember distinctly one moment when a bazooka passed me by on the street. I was lying on the pavement with so many others, unwilling to give ground because I was told not to the passing soldiers, our masked bodies daring them to shoot, but also, to be honest, I was goddamn scared shitless. The bazooka was a huge phallic object, obscene and mute and terrifying. And I remember thinking, lying there on that street, looking at the bazooka, okay, that's it, we're done for. And we had no clue or hope that we would survive our protests or even win. And yet we did. We were active readers who stuck to democracy's plot. We questioned the text. We interrogated our readers' desire, and we kept to the story, refusing to leave democracy behind. Even now, with the new Marcos in power, yes, the storytelling of fascists never dies. And that is important for us to remember in this moment in America. This is one lesson the Philippines offers America. If you don't put the fascists in jail, if you don't put them in their place, the fascists return. And yes, the return of the Marcos son. Yes, the return of the Marcos son, and before that, the rise of another fascist, Duterte, whose campaign was financed, as he said himself, by the Marcoses. They're on their winning formula, the affective fallacies of social media disinformation, the fiction entrepreneurship of algorithm capitalism that defines our authoritarian era, so that the current government, Marcos Jr., has suspended this day as a national holiday in the Philippines, and by that erasure, preserving their fable that the Marcos years were years of glory, the golden years of the country. That kind of painful fiction is topic for another speech. And yet I still have weird hope for the Philippines. Resistance is in its DNA, its identity. I have talked here about an aspect of novel making, reflexivity and readership that I think is essential to democracy. Another word for it, I guess, is activism. I'm defining activism as a form of readership in which society is our fluid text, and we choose to enact upon it a reading of the nation's better illusions in those moments when we don't know what will happen next, when we move to make democracy happen. So I'll end this talk with that other aspect of novel making and democracy, that is, novels themselves. One weird aspect of the Philippines is that its revolution was, in some sense, sparked by a novel. The work of the novelist, the national hero, Jose Rizal, with whom I'll end because I absolutely love him. My second book, The Revolution According to Raimundo Mata, was written in homage to Rizal, except, of course, I ended up writing a comic novel, which never bodes well for heroes. One character, Estrella Espejo, a nationalist scholar from my province, Leyte, a Waray who scribbles her spleen in copious footnotes. In this novel, my characters, who are quarreling historians, create the novel in footnotes, an emblem of the endless revisability of the Philippine Revolution. The nationalist scholar Estrella Espejo has this to say about Rizal and the Philippine Revolution against Spain and America. A distinctive quality of this war was its reliance on reading. Literacy was the charming obsession of many a revolutionary. Annoying foreign observers, such as St. Francis Clare Watson, or was he Francis Clare St. Watson, said Americans came to civilize the natives. Ha! That is an irony not lost on a single Filipino forced to read all 342 pages and 999,000 words of Rizal's No Limitang Here in high school. And I had to read Rizal in translation in Tagalog. But you know, what eyes will do anything for the nation. The American Revolution had farmers and dentists. The French Revolution had lawyers. Our prime mover was a poet. The Philippines may be the only country whose War of Independence began with a novel, and a first novel at that. Rizal's No Limitang Here, also called Touch Me Not. By 1896, readers were risking their lives all over the place to smuggle pamphlets and decode anagrams of heroic names. Membership of the Katipunan, the Revolutionary Secret Society, rose dramatically with the publication of the first and last distributed issue of a newsletter, Kalayaan. Histories of the war refer constantly to memos to the war front, distributed decalogues, intercepted letters, confiscated libraries. It is said that unread peasants gained revolutionary passion via the recitation of Passion, the holy narration of the death of Christ. The peasant Katipuneros were vessels of material text as much as of their unworldly God. Lastly, an argument in a printing press led prematurely to revolt. It is a truism that our revolution existed and lives on as text. As you can see, it's another novel about acts of reading as revolutionary moments. I happen to be teaching Rizal now for the first time here in Manoa in a class called Nation and Narration. Though I have obsessively read Rizal, especially to write my second novel, I've never actually taught him. So thanks to the university for giving me this chance to enact my obsession upon others. Rizal's two books, the Noli and the Fili, as we call them, are central to Benedict Anderson's text on nationalism, Imagined Communities, in which Anderson theorizes how nation-making comes to be through an elaboration of the effects of narration in what Anderson calls print capitalism. His exemplary text in his elucidation of nation-making is that novel that begot the Filipino nation, Rizal's Noli Me Tangere. The country was no nation in 1887 when Rizal published the work that mirrored the country's oppression under Spain. Rizal read his nation by writing it, and then oddly, by doing so, he conceived it, a weird spiral, somewhat like a plot in speculative fiction. He constructed a mirror of the Filipino nation that was not yet, creating a panoply of characters and plurality of voices, ilustrado and outcast, student and cochero, journalists and blasphemers, magicians and philosophers, friars who acted like bandits, and bandits who acted like heroes, women who died or went mad under priestly control, and, well, more women who died and went mad under priestly control. He did have a lot of those. He used patterns of doubling and resurrections and structures of mirroring that reenacted acts of both reading and writing. It is the mirroring that's the point in Rizal. His novels are highly refractive performances of rage in which the reader is constantly confronted by ambiguities, instabilities, disappointments, and possibility. In his Memorias, Mabini, one of my favorite Filipino heroes, the great polemicist of the war against America, a man so principled that he chose exile to Guam over swearing allegiance to the United States when he was captured in 1901. Mabini recalled in 1899, Rizal was already dead 3 years, in a prescient statement when Filipinos and Americans were still amigos. Ahora sabrá que el pueblo se levantó en masa invocando la memoria de Rizal, y no para ser instrumento de las ambiciones del gobierno americano. Ahora conocerá que quien alienta al pueblo en la presente lucha es Rizal, que desde su tumba nos grita. Now you will know that people rose up invoking the memory of Rizal not to be an instrument of the ambitions of the American government. Now you will know that who encourages the people in the present fight is Rizal, who from his grave shouts at us. Filipino resistance is related to the brave, heartbreaking war Filipinos waged twice, first against Spain with American guns, then with knives and rage against the Americans, their friends who betrayed them for their expansionist plot in 1898 that had repercussions here in Hawaii and in Guam, Puerto Rico, and of course Cuba, the nub of that Spanish-American war that was America's alibi in the Philippines. All of us of that 1898 imperial plot who share also this strength, our history of resistance and struggle for decolonization. Whereas the Pyrrhic victory of the colonizer lies in the lasting self-harm of its violent and blind desire. And it's been a revelation to me, teaching Rizal now in our current particular moment of contingency, in what seems to be a historical conjuncture in America now, in our current political, homogeneous empty time, whose end we don't yet know, when we are on the brink of another fateful, anxiety-producing, globally significant election here in America. My own work has been concerned with making transparent the sense of contingency in our notions of ourselves. What I have been trying to do in my novels is to figure out how to convey through my structural choices what I feel is true about humans, that we are constructed by illusions, but that does not mean we should not strive for the better ones, the ones that ensure others and not just ourselves to be free. That is why my novels always believe in books. In fact, my novels have books within books within books, even as they subvert the book stability. America does have those better illusions in the work of its novelists and critical race theorists, the scholarly and creative work of so many of us here, of so many activists organizing here in the university and everywhere in the country over rights that are being trampled even as we speak. For me, what America should look back to, my favorite story is Reconstruction. I'm always so moved by that telling. In my mind, it should be the founding story, those 8 years when the nation strove for and even had interracial democracy. But as we know, the country will take 1 step forward, 40 steps back. We get Reconstruction, then Jim Crow. We get the Civil Rights Act, then Nixon. We get Hawaii's Barack Obama, then that unspeakable person from Queens. 1 step forward, 100 years back, too often leaving our better illusions behind. Because too long, America has allowed itself to live without much self-doubt as a racist corporatist thug cloaked in its dreams as democracy's savior. Of course, by America here, I mean only some. But as we know, our electoral college tells us minority rule is an American way. In this current moment, when once again our tax money is used to indiscriminately bomb civilians, children, mothers, families in Gaza, coming for the natural rights of those in Rafah, their natural right to live, we are at another crossroad. I'd like to note this because this thing though, because this complexity is important to me. Even in my most outraged moments about Gaza, I have huge empathy for all Jews. Parallel to my rage always is this recognition, palpable in my skin as I say this, of the history of anti-Semitism, also a construction of the West, of whiteness, of cruel and malevolent supremacy. Because I'm a novelist, my gaze is always refractive, and my job is to be alert to simultaneous realities. I teach the history of anti-Semitism to my students, and I know, as someone who is not Jewish, that I cannot fathom the fear of the Jews, many of whom I also know are protesters, and they are a part of my child's family. But like those protesters, I fail to be convinced that any state has a natural right to bomb others whom it has kept under occupation for decades, under the illusion it is the only way to feel safe. Genocide is happening in Gaza. Committed under the name of one more nation's illusions and our tax dollars. Our moment now commands us again to read the text carefully, the fictions of authoritarians, probe our own desires as readers, and each of us in our own way must try to move our country to its better illusions, to a better outcome for our place in the world's plot for peace, such as the demand for ceasefire now. As a writer, I was lucky to have a model for art in dire times. What Rizal did was write incendiary, persistently reflexive, political art novels without apology. He forged a path in theorizing anti-colonialism through art and understood early what we in our writing workshops today have been late to recognize, that polemics and art do mix. In fact, they should. In one letter, he states, the question of writing in more or less literary style is secondary. The principal thing is to think and feel rightly, work with a purpose, and the pen will take care of transmitting it. The principal thing is not to be a literary man, but to be a good man, a good citizen. When I was younger, a workshop student under the sway of new criticism, I would have thought this notion antique. Now that I know better, a novelist writing under late capitalism, I see that it is radical. Rizal said in the same letter, let the Philippine Bolo speak. Born in the same decade as W.E.B. Du Bois, Rizal re-envisioned history in one of his books, The Morga, in the same vein as Du Bois, writing about Reconstruction. He imagined the desires of the oppressed as a counterweight to the lies of the oppressor. Unlike Du Bois, Rizal did not live long enough to test his theories against an archive, to experience revolution, or even to change his mind. He was executed by firing squad at the age of 35, 4 years before the dawn of the 20th century. As an experimental novelist making political art in his colonizer's tongue, joining it with the wit of his primal Tagalog, and sometimes even with his tertiary one, Chabacano, Rizal is original gangster, perhaps because he so adamantly centered himself, his being Filipino, That is, an artist of many worlds and tongues, but singular desire, ang mga karapatan ng tao, a people's right to live fully human. The clarion artistry of Rizal, world-embracing, rigorous, always experimenting, is a throwback to that necessary concept of that revolutionary era that he helped to forge. A quite simple notion of art that seems increasingly imperative under capitalism's rampage, imperialism's domain, colonialism's traces, patriarchy's pall, and white nationalism's scourge. The notion that art and politics must mix. It is instructive that Rizal made his multifaceted, ambiguous art on the paradoxical truism that, quote, the question of writing is secondary, and that with such clarity, he helped to rouse a nation. For Rizal, as perhaps for us artists and citizens today, to make complex art, to honor our complex nation, the principal thing must be protest. And in that way, we leave no democratic ideals behind. In conclusion, on this day, February 22, 2024, I'd like to dedicate this speech to the 35 computer technicians readers of democracy's text, whose decision to walk prefaced the EDSA revolt 38 years ago. I raise a drink to them. Tagay. Mabuhay haera. My thanks also to the Inouye Chair Committee, to everyone who helped make my visit such an enormous pleasure, to the family of the Senator, Daniel Inouye, and above all, I mentioned this earlier, I write about women, above all to the memory of Maggie Inouye. As a novelist, I write about women, and I was happy to note her name embedded in this honor that the university has given to me. Maupay nga gabi ha iyong nga tanan. Salamat. I understand that Ria will be in charge of the questions if there are any questions.
Yes, if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand and I will come around to you. One in the back.
Just into here? Awesome. Thank you so much, Mahalo nui. You made a very interesting point in your conversation about us going 100 years back, these progresses and the steps of what we do so, about the illusions that are better and the truths we could pull from them. If we go more than 100 years back, we look at 1893 and we look at the illegal occupation of Hawaii. We look at this conversation that we're having now, and in the conversation you gave with us, the labeling of this space is America. If we're thinking about already taking those better imaginations, shouldn't one of the things that we let go of right now be that this is America or ever has rightfully been, without that same veneer of coloniality and the extension of manifest destiny that let the United States support the Marcos regime?
Sorry, what the last part of that? What's the connection?
The same extension of manifest destiny that let the United States support the Marcos regime is the very same movement.
Are you saying fuck that manifest destiny?
Fuck it, absolutely.
Oh, yeah?
But
Okay.
to do that, especially in this imagining, we have to recognize that here is stolen land.
Yeah, right. I agree. Absolutely.
Are there any other questions?
One of my one of the things I'm thinking about in the Philippines too is indigeneity, because the Philippines is really a settler nation where all of these other groups that seem to be not included in the nation, the tribal groups, Muslim Mindanao, etc., end up not being part of the national story as much as they should be. And so even that, I would say there's something about the issue of Hawaii and the Philippines in that sense, for the Filipinos to be a lot clearer about all the other groups that get to be excluded from the national story. So I've always thought that one of the ways to understand the Philippines better might be, and this is something that I'm thinking about as a novelist, would be to figure out how the thread of the indigenous runs through all of these stories of resistance that I've been talking about in my novel. And I think if I manage to figure out that thread of indigeneity, I would be able to create this coherent story of the Filipino. Yeah. If one day I manage to do it. That's why I'm here in Hawaii, because I want to learn about it.
Gina, thank you so much for your talk. You spoke out of the heart and out of deep conviction. I'll only connect to a very few things, obviously. The role of poets and artists in revolutions. You spoke of Palestine. The Palestinian Constitution has been written by a poet, Mahmoud Darwish,
Yes.
who is one of the most incredible Arab poets of the 20th century. And artists, when a wall was built to divide the sections of what used to be one Palestine, artists have taken all the letters of the Palestinian Constitution as written by Mahmoud Darwish and have scattered them. So the message is very clear. The letters have to come back together. And when that happens, there is a constitution again, and there is a country. So just wanted to add that as a comment.
Thank you so much. That is very beautiful. Thank you.
Mahalo nui, Gina.
Brandy, my favorite
Aloha.
poet.
Aloha nui. This was amazing. Thank you so much. I feel so just blessed to be here and to learn from you. Mahalo.
Thank you, Brandy.
I wanted to hear more about algorithm capitalism. I'm really interested in that. And I see it as you mentioned Benedict Anderson's print capitalism. And I'm wondering if there's also a connection there that you see. But what is algorithm capitalism as you're thinking of it? And
Okay,
you're
I
seeing
just
it
made
today?
that up.
No, but it's brilliant. It's brilliant, though.
I just made that up because I was teaching Anderson to my students, So I was teaching Imagine Communities, and I was reading his ways of thinking about the way he connects the rise of print material, that industrial piece of history, the rise of print material, print capitalism, the ways in which people were reading novels at the time, because novels he talks about homogeneous empty time, the ways in which in novels one has an ability to make these connections across time and within those spaces in the novel. And so he's connecting the nation making with the reading of novels, with the rise of print, and he calls it print capitalism. So I was thinking about that with my students because we are also, there's a lot of reading going on, but it's reading online, reading memes, reading in social media. So there is also a kind of print capitalism going on, but it's algorithm capitalism because it is very much produced from the companies that are creating your rage, they are choosing things to create emotion. That's how they make money. They're making money on our emotions, and our algorithms are their profit. That's how they're creating their profit. So I was thinking about what does that mean in terms of what he's saying. He was talking about nation making, but what are we seeing? I'm seeing here an authoritarianism, a huge turn to authoritarianism around the world. And I will say that the Filipinos, the Duterte government was ground zero for that experiment in algorithm capitalism, in that Facebook had an experiment of trying to go all around, trying to go outside the United States and figuring out which countries they would use as experiments. One of the countries they chose was the Philippines, and the choosing of the Philippines had to do with that. So they allowed Filipinos to get online as long as they got on Facebook as well. So all of these Filipinos, more than 90%, got on Facebook because that's how they got online. And that was used by Cambridge Analytica, who were the Duterte campaign used Cambridge Analytica before the unspeakable guy person used Cambridge Analytica. So the Philippines was ground zero in that experiment. And I do think it's one of the ways we got Duterte. I mean, there are a lot of other things. There's the issue of really lack of opportunity and the poverty of the Philippines that makes people go with someone who's going to give them a promise of something. And I think that's capitalism. Outright capitalism. But that's this algorithm capitalism, which was researched by Maria Ressa. So Maria Ressa Rappler blew open the Cambridge Analytica's ties to the Dutertes. That's how she won the Nobel Peace Prize, for her work on what I call algorithm capitalism. So I think we need to be aware of the ways in which, so I think there's something going on between the ways we're responding to society and the algorithm capitalism that's happening, because it allows that capture of ideology.
And then I believe we have 2 more questions.
And it is weird to me that the Philippines was once again, because they love technology. We love new things.
Okay, thank you for this talk. You've addressed a little bit what I'm curious about, but I'm over here. But I'm just curious. You spent time talking about Rizal and mentioning the Philippines as the only nation where a revolution started from a novel. And in 2024, I'd like to hear maybe your thoughts on the power of the novel in 2024. It's obviously in a different place in terms of its position in popular culture and consumption and how people engage with literature. And I'm wondering how you see novel and literature as a whole sort of functioning in a space where, attention spans are shortened and things like that.
Yeah, it is why I started thinking about this algorithm capitalism in terms of novel making, because if it does supersede that Anderson's concept there of ways in which you create communities, a sense of identity and belonging, and a sense of here's who I am. If you did that through novels in Anderson's concept, what does it mean that we are in the social media world where we're creating communities of belonging and identity driven by the profits of these capitalists, really? So there's no sense of an ethics and of one's imagined community. I do think novels still retain a sense of an ethic of how we're imagining our communities. I will say this about my students, for instance. They really prefer, I make them read novels, but they prefer to have novels, actual novels, like not to have it on their tablets. They are allowed to have it, but they like the pages. So one thing we might be able to count on is the way young kids just get bored and want something new and maybe want to get a book, because it's new, I will say about novel writing, the novels that are happening right now, and ways in which they might be moving people in other ways. For instance, African American writing right now, Indigenous America, the work of poets, the work of Brandy, the work of Lily Long Soldier. These, I think there are ways in which just by continuing on and having that kind of faith, because one thing that I understand, I have a daughter who grew up in this age. One thing I understand about them is that I'm just hearing, it's just all anecdotal, but they really want to have meaning, I think it's really important for their health to have a sense that their life has meaning. And I think the ethos in novels help to provide that. And I think the novels right now that are being written are really, in many ways, launched with that ethos in mind, providing in certain ways an alternative to the social media constructs that the children actually understand as well, I think.
Thank you for your wonderful talk.
Oh,
It's
thank
just
you.
wonderful. Several times in your experience, you talked about the senator who died. Why did you not say his name?
Oh, Ninoy
And-
Aquino?
And if you were to talk about him or to go about writing about him, what could you say about that? What could you tell us?
I realized that. I know that in another draft, I did mention his name because his name is the airport. I was going to have a joke about his name as the airport where he was killed. Ninoy Aquino International Airport. The Marcoses have not yet changed the name. I'm sure they will one day. Ninoy Aquino, okay. I, as a student at the University of the Philippines, was asked to go that day to the airport to help serenade him by my friend Cochise Bernabe, who was part of his broad, his fraternity broad, whatever they call it. And I said, absolutely not, because for me and in a reading of Philippine history in class, etc., Ninoy Aquino was just another bourgeois political twat. And I didn't see him as a hero. He was in the same class as the Marcoses. Maybe even more so, because his wife, Cory Aquino, came from one of the richest families of the country. She was a rice and coconut heiress. And the cost of rice in the Philippines, the price of rice, used to be dictated by their farms' prices. So as an activist, I wasn't into him. But when the leftists in the country said no to the snap elections, they wanted to boycott the snap elections, I also said no as a citizen, as a Filipino. I said, no, I am going to join. I am going to vote. I'm going to join the marches for Cory Aquino. I didn't believe in her. But I believed in the possibility of that historical juncture that we could get rid of Marcos and that through Cory Aquino, we could get change through her election. So Ninoy Aquino, for many people, the bravery of Ninoy Aquino when he returned home, it seemed in the stories of Ninoy, not on the day when I refused. I completely regret not going to the airport, by the way. As a novelist, that's not good. You have to be there. You have to be in the goddamn room where he was assassinated. So on the day he died, there was no sense of what he was doing. But in the stories of Ninoy Aquino, the bravery of Ninoy Aquino in deciding to return home when he was told not to go home and when there was so much danger for him is really important to recognize. He was coming home for a particular, he understood that there was this historical conjuncture of a possible change. And he did it, and he died for it. And I do think he should be honored for it, for that bravery. I do think that my dogmatic self as a child, I was like, whatever. I was so young. My dogmatic sense of a child needs to be coupled also with that refractive sense that I've learned as a writer, that there are multiple ways of seeing people, and it is healthy to understand that multiplicity.
And then we have one last question for you.
Hi, I'm in the back over here. Hello. As others have expressed, I wanted to say thank you so much for this talk. It really, the way that you strung together the history of revolution and literature is really helps me to see things in a new light. That's really profound.
Thank you so much.
And my question is kind of around that same intersection, and specifically your identity and your practice as a writer and as a political activist and advocate. And so I was kind of wondering, I know there's like, all writers have different processes for their writing, but for many writers, it seems like there's a creative chaos where you're writing stories with characters, and sometimes those characters can maybe get out of hand or do things that you're not expecting them to do, and the story can kind of go off track. And so I was wondering how, maybe what your experience with this kind of creative writing while also writing with a political message and kind of keeping that message centered and on track, and just what that experience has been like for you, and particularly if you've sort of run into troubles and if they've resolved themselves.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in this piece, that I am lucky in that I had a sense of how that you can do art and really kind of, Rizal is a very refractive artist. So you can do art and you can do politics at the same time and know without apologizing for it. I did grow up with what you call new criticism, where the short story had to be a particular kind of short story. And because the writing workshop, okay, here's one thing about imperialism. The writing workshop structure of the Philippines was also captured by the CIA. So there was a whole way of writing the short story that was very internal, not political, et cetera, but I refused. So one thing that I do recognize in myself as a writer is that I absolutely believe propaganda is good, good propaganda. I don't think that propaganda is a bad thing. I don't think the politics in art diminishes one's art. So absolutely, I agree. I go with that. Absolutely, also, I will take pleasure in my goddamned art. I will do what I need to do in order to make the art a thing of joy and beauty for me. And those two things need not be separated. They need, to be honest, when I can see them coming together, that novel is a novel. So I always insist in that possibility of both together, politics and art. It is true that my novels end up being very complex and dense, whatever. But I do think, partly also, I believe in the reader. The reader is part of my texts, and the reader has to be as smart as my text. And I think I get them there. So I believe in the reader. I believe in confusing the reader. I believe in messing up their minds. You have to do that. That's part of my activism. And so I think it's just this is just me. I just have a very strong, really annoying belief in what I believe art can be, which is both political, absolutely polemical, and yet ambiguous, and art born.
Thanks. Hi. Mahalo once again, Gina, for this moving discussion on the truths of Philippine history. As we end this Q&A, we would actually like to take this time to announce the winners for the online book raffle hosted for Gina's most recent book, La Tercera. The 5 winners for this raffle are Beanie with the Instagram username @justbeanie, Rihanna, Yuta or @worshiptheocean on Instagram, Dado or Maulane on Instagram, and finally, Jensen or Bits of Bits on Instagram as well. For these winners, kindly meet me outside the book signing table to claim your free book, and you will be given first priority during this book signing. If you are interested, however, in joining these raffles, be sure to check out our Instagram and Facebook page @UH_BTSS. Congratulations again to the winners, and mahalo once again, Gina, for being with us here tonight. Feel free to take some cookies and tea right outside the venue. Thank you.
So I'm sorry, just before everybody leaves, I want to just say one thing to Gina. I started the University of Hawaii 10 years ago and have been a part of the Dan and Maggie Inouye committee. And I want to say out of all those years, this has been the most delightful, inspiring, amazing talk that I've ever attended. And I just want to mihi you and offer you that